You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 245 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I'm recording this show on 9/11, and certainly 9/11 is the most infamous and remembered day in my lifetime. Certainly all of my peers, and I'm guessing pretty much everybody older than us and a few years younger than us, remember exactly where we were on 9/11 and, what our reaction was to that event and, what the people around us were doing. I can remember the names of, some of my classmates on that day and what they said, the adults around us and what they said. And, for what I do now with this podcast and with my daily news roundup and really trying to keep track of the American empire and just see what's happening around the world, it's hard to pick a single day that maybe has as big of an impact as 9/11. The only other one I could really even point to would maybe be, the first use of a nuclear weapon. Now, on a previous show, and I could link to it in the show notes page if anybody wants to listen to it, I did talk about kind of my 9/11 experience and, where I was and what I was doing on that day. So I'm not going to go through all of that again. I did want to point out that you can find this show at libertarianinstitute.org. And at the Libertarian Institute, there's a lot of great people doing a lot of great stuff. One of those people is Jared LaBelle, who is putting together a hashtag Why I'm Anti-War campaign on 9/11. And, I'm sure we'll be active for the next couple of days. And so what, Jared is asking people to do is go out there and tweet why they're anti-war. And, tweet that at the Libertarian Institute. If you heard of it on this show or, just in general, you could tweet it at myself as well, KYAAALE on Twitter. And, we could get this thing trending and maybe people will start to see in their feeds, why their friends are saying that they're anti-war. And, certainly I think if you're going to look at the kind of conflicts and why I'm focusing on today's show, which are the, kind of 17 years of war, and all the wars we've fought since 9/11, it's hard to at least not be anti all of those wars. I'll also point out that I actually did a show in a personal favorite show of mine was this one that I did with Patrick McFarlane of the Liberty Weekly podcast and freelance journalist Will Porter, two of my very good friends. And we all just talked about why we're anti-war. And, Will was able to give, really good insight, as far as the journalism community, and Pat on, the impacts of 9/11, the terror wars on our Constitution and on, the laws and the executive powers in this country. And so I think that's a terrific episode. And so I tweeted it out today with the hashtag Why I'm Anti-War, and I'll certainly link to that in the show notes page as well. So the one thing I did want to recount on my 9/11 experience was, that I'm very young at the time. I think I'm in 4th or 5th grade, about 10 years old. And, as Scott Horton explains, the imagery for me was completely perfect. And that was that, these planes came out of the clear blue sky. In that, we had no idea that this would happen to us. Certainly before this, I didn't feel like America was ever at war, although, I'm pretty young. But certainly as the way it was explained to me in context was that we weren't at war with anyone. It was peacetime. Everything was nice and great for America. And, there wasn't a war going on. And then suddenly this attack happened and that changed everything forever. I think the most important thing that I've, really come to learn since 9/11 was that it wasn't an attack out of a clear blue sky. And that the reason that this attack happened was that America was at war with the people. I think of the greater Muslim world and the greater Middle East is maybe a way to describe this. From reading the fantastic book by Colonel Andrew Bacevich, War for the Greater Middle East, I really came to find out that, the United States has been meddling in the Middle East for a very long time. Of course, the first being the coup in Iran, And then, there's the attack on Gaddafi, I believe in the 80s. You have the United States support of Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War between Iraq and Iran. That saw massive devastation to the civilian populations of those two countries. The arming and the assisting of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s to combat Soviets in Afghanistan. You had the constant support of Israel through all these years, and the oppression of the Palestinians, who certainly are the victims of that situation, and certainly the United States provides very critical support to Israel to allow that status quo to go on, and we give them a lot of political leverage in that whole situation. You had the war against Saddam in the early 1990s, and then the bombing of Iraq all through the 1990s. At the time, you have the United States and I believe then U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright, saying that she believed that the 500,000 Iraqi children who were killed by the U.S. sanctions, that price was worth it. So certainly they felt like that they were on the receiving end of the American war. And of course you had the U.S. meddling around in several other countries, but Somalia being a good example of a more limited engagement, Lebanon as well. And so it was for all of those reasons that 9/11 happens. And so while it looks like the plane comes out of absolutely nowhere, really, this should have been something that the American people knew, is that one of the risks to our foreign policy, that we're deciding that, because we want cheap oil and we believe that we know what's better for people than they do, we're going to go around the world and, we're going to kill a dictator here and keep a waterway open there and build a pipeline here and defend it from this dictator there. But that this means that we're going to kill a lot of innocent civilians. And that means that we may, radicalize some extremists on the other end, and they may try to respond by killing our civilians. That this should have been part of the American calculation way back then, and it never was because the war wasn't discussed. And I think if you could have people take one takeaway from 9/11, looking back on it now, is that, that it was a response and it wasn't the kind of opening act of this war. Now, I just want to address this really quick, and it seems silly that I have to, but I think the main objection to this point is going to be that in some way I'm devaluing the memory or the legacy of the people died. A lot of people did a lot of heroic things on 9/11. I mean, if the story of the Pennsylvania plane is, true, some people heroically took down the plane in order to, prevent another, kind of New York style attack where they try to fly the plane into the building. There was a lot of people in New York City and in the Pentagon who did very brave things, risking their own lives in order to save people. And that's, a very honorable act. And I also don't think it, legitimizes what the terrorists did in any way. It explains it. It means that the plane didn't come out of the clear blue sky, but it doesn't mean that's all right. Obviously, what they did is extremely reprehensible. And it's just as terrible as all the thousands, of the civilians that the United States has killed over all the years, right? Like, it's terrible on both sides. I think another takeaway, and something else that's worth talking about on 9/11, is the decision that America has made since 9/11, and trying to evaluate if they've kind of achieved their overall objective, at least the one sold to the American people, right, which is to make us safer and, I guess, kill jihadists around the world. Like, really, that's the point of the war on terror. So to do that, I thought I'd go through kind of the military authorizations and some of the things that have happened since 9/11, some of the wars, and just, I think by going through, we're just going to see that actually we've made things worse and worse and worse every time. So Afghanistan's, I think, the most easy place to start, just because, this is the place America goes first after 9/11. In Afghanistan on 9/11, I believe Cynthia Storer, who CIA analyst on the Scott Horton show, explained that there were about 400, bin Laden type followers in Afghanistan, people who actually wanted to wage kind of this global jihad idea. And I think estimates are by December of 2001, so we're talking, 2-3 months after the actual terror attack, at least half of those guys including some of the leadership, is actually captured or dead. And you have, just a couple hundred, 100 or 200 more fighters still running around, including Osama bin Laden. Now, the 2001 authorization for use of military force did authorize the United States to go against the Taliban as well. If you read the authorization, this is the group that protected Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Now, in Eric Margulies' War at the Top of the World, he kind of explains the position of the leader of the Taliban at the time, Mullah Omar, when, he's kind of trying to deal with the situation he has with Osama bin Laden and kind of upholding the Pashtun Code, and at the same time realizing that this Osama bin Laden dude's a pretty bad and dangerous guy for him. In Fool's Errand, Scott Horton's book on the Afghan War, he points out how, the Taliban really did hint a couple times that the United States could go ahead and take out Osama bin Laden, and for various reasons, I think including not understanding what the Taliban message was, the United States doesn't end up taking out Osama bin Laden under Bill Clinton. And so, it can't be denied that the Taliban, I guess, did provide Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden some protection. However, pretty quickly after 9/11, that they were willing to give this guy up, and I guess his followers up, and the United States refused this from the Taliban, essentially. Even though, as Scott Horton points out, the Taliban were eventually willing to a deal where they surrender Osama bin Laden to any third country, and the United States rejected this. So while you could say that the Taliban did support Al-Qaeda, they certainly weren't international jihad types. They weren't terrorists. And I think at the time, America really should have questioned whether it was worth going to war with the Taliban or not. And, just having the Taliban turn the Al-Qaeda guys over, and then, the United States could have imposed some sanctions or something like that against the Taliban. But it certainly didn't seem necessary to actually overthrow that government, just looking at who the Taliban were. However, the Taliban government was defeated and driven from power, and the United States decided to stay, and that's a large part of the problem here, as then you do have the situation where you create an insurgency out of the Taliban, and now they're fighting against an occupation, and that means they start using these suicide-style terrorist attacks, and, really then kind of fulfill the narrative needed among the American media, where you now have the Taliban being terrorists, even though they're not attacking, like the United States itself, just the United States within Afghanistan. However, even, looking now, there's a recent New York Times piece that says the Taliban are really doing a lot better than even the U.S. military is admitting. They're like contesting or controlling, I believe, like 62% of Afghanistan. They're just having success after success. And there's this really good, I can't believe I've said this, New York Times article that I'm going to link to in the show notes page, and just compares and contrasts the reality of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan, what the U.S. Military is portraying that situation to be, including reports of the Taliban attack on a pretty significant Afghan city of Ghazni, and they actually took and controlled that city for a few days. So, I think it's hard to even point out and argue here that the United States is currently having military success against the Taliban 17 years after that war began. And certainly, what America is doing to the Taliban, to the Afghan people, not just to the Taliban. And I think the significant part is what they're doing to the Afghan people. This certainly rallies people to the, kind of Islamic State flag, the, Al-Qaeda types, even if the Taliban aren't the Al-Qaeda types. The fact that the United States continues to blow up and, maim and wound very innocent Afghan children is a real problem. And I guess that brings us to the fact that, while there's not an Osama bin Laden right now in Afghanistan, there's not, a leader of Al-Qaeda who's carrying out attacks against the United States in Afghanistan right now. There is a very large fighting ISIS-K, the Islamic State Khorasan province, that's wreaking havoc on the Afghan people. And so there are a lot of these international jihadist types that do exist in Afghanistan. It's not an outstanding number, but then again, if you look at what the situation was on 9/11, there was only 400. And so you can't look at the situation now in Afghanistan as compared to the situation on 9/11 and say, well, this is a situation that has at the very least improved to the state where the American people are now safer and more prosperous. We've wasted almost $1 trillion in that country. 2,200 plus lives have been lost in that country. Countless others have been injured either mentally, or physically, and, their lives not what they would have been otherwise. And, this is just another, American loss in Afghanistan. The ISIS case story does bring us over to Pakistan. The United States has a pretty complicated relationship with Pakistan being a kind of a loosely held together nuclear power state at very contentious odds with its next door neighbor, India, and the United States trying to balance the Pakistan-India relationship with the fact that Pakistan sees Afghanistan and having a friendly government in Kabul, like the Taliban, essential to Pakistani national security and national defense, with the fact that America wants to put a different government in power in Kabul. So, this is a lot of very complicated geostrategic problems that the United States has here. And obviously, if we look at the very cold relationships right now between the United States and Pakistan, the fact that the United States is cutting the aid we send to Pakistan and try to get them to put more pressure on what the United States accuses of being Afghani militants, I guess either Haqqani network, the Taliban, or ISIS-K hiding out in Pakistan, going back and forth. And it looks like even maybe forming more cozy relationships with, India over Pakistan. And, this is certainly a very complicated situation, but again, it seems to be something that's only creating more instability in Southern Asia, which of course a nuclear war there would be absolutely devastating on the American people, even if there's no war in America. There's a fantastic interview, by the way, Scott Horton's show. He interviews Daniel Ellsberg, the former nuclear war planner, and he really explains how dangerous these nuclear weapons are and how even a nuclear war between Pakistan and India, the dust that's kicked up in the atmosphere will kill, I believe, hundreds of millions of people. Absolutely astounding and dangerous. And so by creating this instability there and, by the Obama drone war had a big impact. This is in 2009. Obama launches a drone war against the Taliban in Pakistan. I believe they end up sending maybe the suicide bomber to the United States, the underwear bomber to the United States. But there is a terrorist that comes out of the Taliban, and, they get pushed over the border and become the Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan. All right, so in Yemen, the first result, I think, of the war on terror is the United States looks to some of these Middle Eastern dictators, and we want to carry out, different kinds of raids and attacks in their country. And for them also, I guess, to kind of kill terrorists for us. And in Yemen, there was a very willing man named Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was, the only ever dictator of a united Yemen. And we decide to start giving him weapons, and he ends up using those weapons to attack Al-Qaeda, but also a group of Zaidi Shias in northern Yemen, known as the Houthis, and he attacks them several times with the United States weapons that we're giving him. And this ends up empowering the Houthis, actually, not hindering them, and I think also helps Al-Qaeda, which forms, I believe, in 2006. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and this is typically cited as the most dangerous jihadist group in the world today, as far as carrying overseas attacks to the United States. The United States launches a drone war in Yemen, and in this drone war, we see a lot of the things that continue to be the best Al-Qaeda propaganda as far as getting people, recruited into their ranks, and that is these drone attacks that are double taps. That means that we blow up a target with our drone strike, and we wait for the rescuers to come in, and then we blow it up again. And so this is me and Lab. Doctors and first responders and very innocent people have died. Our drones also hover for, hours and, in places days at a time. This has caused significant PTSD in Yemeni children. And has just killed so many innocent people. The one great example is Obama actually carried out a drone strike against 2 Americans. One of the Americans was actually the son of the first one, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but his son wasn't, and his son was blown up by an American bomb, and completely innocent kid killed. And so these types of events are a big driver and a big propaganda motive for Al-Qaeda. Now, the United States is now entered into a war against the Houthis in Yemen, along with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And this has actually helped, really destabilize the country and allow for Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula to hold a lot of territory in that country. And I'm sure, this presents them with opportunities to become, enriched through taxes and controlling territory. And it gives them room to plot and to, develop if they do look to attack the United States. There's also an issue that the U.S. allies in this case, like the UAE, are, making deals with these Al-Qaeda guys and enlisting them in their ranks in Yemen and further empowering them, and also fighting against the Houthis, who are the national enemies of AQAP. So again, it's pretty clear that this is a much more dangerous situation for the American people than before. By empowering Saleh and having him attack the Houthis over and over again, created instability in Yemen. Eventually we have a full-blown civil war in the country after the Arab Spring there. And this allows for AQAP to become much more powerful and stronger. A group that didn't even exist on 9/11, remember. Very briefly, Somalia, you had the U.S. interventions there, and these aren't quite as directly related, I think, to 9/11. But the United States ultimately, under Bush, ends up breaking up the ruling kind of coalition in Somalia known as the Islamic Courts Union, and the powerful faction there becomes the youth, Al-Shabaab, and then they swore allegiance to Osama bin Laden. And you now have a couple hundred ISIS fighters in that country as well. And so if you look again on 9/11, even if it's not the direct result of the U.S. kind of war on terror policy to break up the Islamic Courts Union, what ends up happening is you have now a group that controls a large portion of southern Somalia is loyal to Osama bin Laden. Although I would say, and I think this is just important to point out, that I don't know what kind of global jihad feelings and tendencies that the Al-Shabaab guys have, that they would really desire to carry out attack in the United States. In Libya, of course, you have veterans from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They go back home to Libya and they join up mostly the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and they overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. Now, in that country, you had at one time ISIS controlling Gaddafi's former home city of Sirte, but now controlling, large territory in the desert, and a lot of the Islamic jihadists who fought, to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya have since moved on to other West African countries. Of course, the situation in Libya is absolutely horrific for the Libyans. You have slave trade going on there. You have mass rape. You have a very bloody civil war among people who, don't have high morals or anything like that. And summary executions in the streets and all these terrible kind of things. But it's worth mentioning that in a lot of ways that 2011 war there waged by Obama and Hillary spread terrorists to Niger. Of course, you have 4 Americans killed by a group that claims affiliation to the Islamic State. You have Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb that operates over a lot of countries in the Sahel region there, and, wreaks havoc. You have a new group in Mali, JNIM, that is Nusrat al-Islam Muslimin, and they were just designated a terror group by the United States government. But, again, they're fighting a civil war against the government there. And so in all of these places, you have the spread of chaos. You have a terrible situation for the civilians in that country. Of course, they attribute some of their bad situation to the United States. And so that creates more anti-American sentiment. And then just the instability that allows these jihadist types to, gain followers and operate in these regions. Now, I skipped over Iraq and Syria in my first go around because I want to kind of lump these two together and just point out here that the target of the American war actually isn't, a war on terror situation. Saddam Hussein was not Al-Qaeda, and they were only able to torture some people into saying that, but, he didn't believe in the jihad. He just wanted to kind of, keep his dictatorship. Bashar al-Assad, he's actually fighting a civil war against the jihadist types in Syria. And the United States has actually resorted to arming and backing those groups in order to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. And again, Muammar Gaddafi, who is fighting a war against the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, when in fact there were many jihadist elements within that group, and yet the United States decided to bat those rebels. And so I do think, though, if you ask the average person, what's going on in Iraq? Well, we're fighting the war on terror. We're fighting the war in Iraq, but it's all a part of the war on terror. And really, what we're doing is antithetical to fighting the war on terror. Of course, the United States taking out Saddam Hussein in Iraq, disbanding the Iraqi army, and, waging an absolutely brutal war against the Iraqi people, why, in a lot of ways, robbing them, created Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which, of course, breaks off and becomes al-Nusra in Syria, which is, a large Islamic fighting group in the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria that, forms a natural caliphate in the Levant. It's insane, what you end up having there. So I'm not going to get into those conflicts in too much more detail because I do cover them both on the show a lot. But again, just looking at what happened there, where you remove secular dictators, and then you ask the question, well, are Americans safer? Were Americans safer because Saddam Hussein was gone? They absolutely weren't. Saddam wasn't working on a nuclear bomb to kill us, but then we all did create an awfully large void for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then ISIS to become a lot more powerful, and ISIS was able to inspire attacks in the United States. I do hope this show wasn't too tangential. I didn't have as much of an outline as I usually did. But I just wanted to kind of reflect on, this being 9/11 and what's happened. Because, as I kind of said in the beginning, even if you're not anti-war, you should be anti all of these wars. These wars are bad for the United States. They're bad for the American people. And maybe they enrich politicians, they enrich the weapons makers, but it's at the expense of all the rest of us. And, share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. You can find the show there. You can find my daily news roundup there. And the libertarianinstitute.org is doing great things like the hashtag Why I'm Anti-War campaign. You follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE, Facebook, Libertarian Union. If you want to support the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.